Hope everyone can hear me all right. Yeah, great. So my name is Jacob. I'm a third-year PhD student in the law department. I'm also a PhD representative, and in that capacity, I've become really interested in sort of the interaction, but also the lack of interaction among PhD students. And that's what my research has been about, and that I'll present some of that to you today. And of course, social interaction over the past few years has been massively influenced by COVID. But in my own experience, also in the experience of many PhD students at the LSE, at least the ones I spoke to, this is an issue that predates COVID and I think also postdates COVID. So while I recognize that the pandemic is very important, I don't really want to talk about the pandemic today. So I'm going to quickly walk you through my research, but let me first give you a few numbers about the PhD experience. So the Higher Education Policy Institute here in the UK found that over 1/3 of UK PhD students sought help for anxiety during their PhD, and over 80% of PhD students believes that a career in research is isolating and lonely. Okay. More recently, Camille Bou, who is the postgraduate research officer here at the Student Union, conducted a survey among PhD students. She found that almost half of the participants reported mental health problems, as well as loneliness and isolation, as significant challenges in their research. So even though today I'm talking to you about social interaction, I think these numbers also justify why I am in a panel, sort of the academic experience at the LSE. So in order to unpack these numbers, I interviewed 10 PhD students about their experience. And I spoke also with the director of the PhD Academy and the academic representation coordinator at the Student Union. Basically, my research focused on two simple questions. So where and when do PhD students at the LSE interact? And what can be done to make PhD students meet each other and interact more? And the focus on interaction is deliberate because I think it forms a precondition for developing friendships, academic collaborations, community feeling, etc. If we don't meet each other, there can be none of that. So I won't bore you with any comments on the literature, but straight dive into my findings. So where do PhD students meet each other? It's going to be some open doors here, because based on the conversations that I had, it became pretty clear that PhD students primarily meet with peers from within their cohort and their departments when they are working at their departments. And so all participants in my research stressed the importance of proper workspace. As one of them put it, I think it starts with workspace. Give people a space where they can come together, and then they just randomly collide and have all kinds of interactions. Unfortunately, not all departments provide great workspace to PhD students, and a particularly bad example are those PhD students that work in the basement under the George pub. Luckily, they're going to get better accommodation, I think, this year. However, it also became very clear that due to the pandemic, many of the academic events, such as research seminars, are still organized online. And except for the mandatory research seminar as part of your PhD program, there are few official or formal events during which PhD students meet each other and or academic staff. And even though this was not the focus of my research, during the conversations I had, it was frequently emphasized that PhD students experience a lack of connection with staff. Just to give you one example by a third-year PhD student who told me, and I quote, "My supervisor retired and he didn't tell me about the retirement party, but nobody else did either. And then I got told it was because only permanent staff were invited." And this is something that I also know from my own experience, that from the experience of staff students, PhD students are really seen as students and therefore not invited to staff socials and other related events. So beyond the department, it's generally seen as very difficult to meet PhD students from other departments. There are no obvious venues where one can bump into fellow PhD students. And I think this is really a key quote that I got from a first-year PhD student. There's never an event where you know this is a moment where I can meet other PhD students. And the PhD Academy has a space that potentially could serve this function, but in its current form, it's not really seen as appealing. So final year PhD student described the PhD Academy as, and I quote, the most depressing place in the world. Yeah. And what she meant with that is that this space really lacks an obvious function. So it's neither really a workspace, but it's also not a proper social space. And so there's not really a reason to be there. And I think what really struck me in the conversations I had is that those students that tended to say they would go to the PhD Academy only did so because they didn't have proper space within their own departments. This brings me to the question, how do PhD students organize themselves? And what I found in the conversations that I had is that PhD students as a group generally struggle to self-organize, both within but also across departments. And with this I mean that many of the PhD students I spoke to expressed the difficulty of bringing PhD students together for social or academic activities, or even just to work together on campus. And I identified in these conversations a couple of reasons that frequently came up. So firstly is a lack of time and also financial constraints. With the current rates of inflation, it's really a big topic among PhD students, and I think there will be also a presentation on this in the next session. But just to give you one quote from a first-year PhD student, and he said, PhD students want to publish papers, they want to go to conferences, they want to collect data, conduct their own research. They have other jobs outside academia or teaching jobs. They have partners and or children, or childcare responsibility. The list is kind of endless. So in contrast to undergraduate students, and maybe to some extent also postgraduate students, PhD students are much more limited in what they can undertake and pursue in their free time for various reasons. But nonetheless, within departments, the expectation is very much that PhD students organize themselves. And so what came up in many of the conversations I had is that social interaction very much depends on a few individuals taking the lead. So in most departments, PhD representatives initiate social interaction. It's very hard to find volunteers to actually fulfill these roles. And whilst most departments have a social budget for PhD students to use, the amount and rules are often left unspecified. As a student in the anthropology department told me, as a representative, it's kind of expected that on top of the admin, you also organize socials for the other PhD students. But honestly, it depends on the sort of person that is representative and how much they are willing to invest in it. And similarly, beyond individual departments, there's no clear structure to facilitate PhD social interaction at LSE as a whole. So the PhD Academy does not see organizing social activities as part of its core business, which is more on the admin side and professional development, but neither really does the student union. And moreover, in the conversations I had, it became clear that PhD students do not feel connected to the student union, something that was also a finding in the democracy review that the SU conducted itself. And they also do not find their way to the student union fund. And I think that's interesting because the SU has a lot of resources that PhD students potentially could tap into, but currently don't. And so in the last 12 months, not a single PhD student applied for the SU fund. And I think these findings signal to me that if we want to create more social interaction, this is something that needs to be addressed. So we need to enable PhD students better to organize themselves in terms of like organizing social and academic activities, because currently they are falling through the cracks, hence the title of my paper. Brings me to the recommendations in the last minute and a half that I've got. I'll only mention some of them due to the time constraints. But obviously I think there's a role for academic departments here to better enable PhD students to organize social activities. And I think that starts with paying PhD representatives for their role. This is something that happens at the law department, where I'm a PhD rep, but we're the only department, so far as I know, which does this. And I think that should really make it much easier to find people to fulfill these roles, but also to create an expectation that PhD reps organize social activities. And at the same time, departments should also create clear budgets for social activities and create an expectation that these budgets are used. There's also a role for the PhD Academy, and I think the PhD Academy can really create better information and communication channels. So one thing they could do, for example, is make a website, a web page on the PhD Academy dedicated to current PhD student initiatives. For example, there's a women's network, but there's no way to contact the women's network because it's hard to find out who is involved in this network, and they don't have a web page, so it's hard to find them. And then finally, I think what should be done to address this more structural issue is to establish a PhD-run social committee that organizes social activities for PhD students across the school. And this is a bit the most ambitious recommendation, and I haven't fully thought it through. But I think such a committee could be embedded within the PhD Academy, which has the capacity to reach out to all PhD students. And it should be able to access resources from the student union to fund social activities for PhD students. Because all the resources are with the student union, but there are just no PhD students there. And of course, the positions on this committee should be paid in order to also engage PhD students or enable them to do this. So that's it for now. Thank you for listening to my research, and if you want, you can read my report.